Everybody, this is Carson Grubaugh,
Hi, I'm Sean Robinson.
and this is. Do we have our music yet, Sean?
Living the life.
Yeah, some really bad 80s. We'll get there. Sean's gonna make some music for us. Today we're gonna talk about an artist that I'm super excited about. Sean, what you don't seem terribly familiar with Sergio Toppi.
I had never heard of him until you were talking about him, and obviously, just the first exposure, I was blown away by especially the rendering techniques, and I got a very strong Bill Sienkiewicz uh, vibe from
Yeah,
some of it.
Sienkiewicz writes, I think it's this Shiraz Day, one
Oh,
of
really?
these two books I have. He writes when you look at this is Walter Simonson, and this one's Kent Williams. Basically, the intros to these books are all by all the guys like Dave McKean and Kent
Right.
Williams and Bill Sienkiewicz that you'd think are the best, and they're all like, "This is the dude that I wish I could be." So Bill Sienkiewicz is also someone who writes an introduction and
Huh.
goes like, "God, we all just wish we were Sergio Toppi."
Wow.
Um, yeah, so I've got a whole bunch of his books. I'm so happy. There was two done by Archaea, and I was too poor at the time to buy them, so I'd seen them digitally. But I'm able to. I found this one at Second and Charles for $14. If you try and get it on the internet, it's like $80. Luckily, I hadn't gone for that. And there's another one by them called The Collector. And these two that were by Archaea are they're not full stories. All of his stories are like little 8-page kind of cautionary tale,
Yeah.
fable nuggets, basically. Shiraz Day is like the Arabian Nights. So it all has that format. And then more recently, Magnetic Press has been doing, and I'm just so grateful and glad that they're doing it. They've been doing the Collected Toppi, which is, I don't know if it's his complete work, but they're thematic like Japan, the Americas and stuff, collecting his short stories. So the Archaea books are a little bit smaller,
Hmm.
not by much. They're both have glossy paper reproductions. One thing I like about the Magnetic, and this is all of their books. I'm going to do another one-man review of another series that they do because I think Magnetic Press, we're going to gripe a little bit about some of the reprinting in here today, I think, but um, most their and these books look great, but there's a weird thing going on that me and Sean are curious about. Their color books are some of the best color books I've seen, so I want to show some of that. And all of their books always have these rounded corners, which is
Nice.
something I don't know I like. So I'm
It's a
very
nice,
happy. Sorry, go ahead.
really nice cover design on the volume five, the one we're going to be taking a look at today, and volume six looks great too.
Yeah, yeah. And I have scans from volume 1 and volume 6 of this, and then I think I have one scan from Shiraz Day, so we can compare because the print issue that we're both curious about shows up in the Magnetic and the Archaea. So I think it might be the files that they're getting rather than something they're doing wrong. Because um, let me see. I think his name's Mike Kennedy. He was someone that was supporting us during the Strange Death campaign that runs Magnetic. Am I getting his name right? Yeah, Mike Kennedy, who runs Magnetic and Neurobellum Productions, has fantastic taste in what they print, and their print quality is always like the colors that they get in their books are amazing. So I don't want to knock on them at all. He's been a big supporter, and I love what he does. But I have to say, like, I've been looking for Toppi stuff since 2001, and it's only now in the last few years getting reproduced. The computer decided that my story was not worth telling,
Well, we
and
just cut out something really, really juicy that you wish you knew, but unfortunately,
yeah, I was gonna tell you about an instructor sharing a hotel with his students. So uh, I was saying I'm really glad that Toppi is finally getting English translations. I've been waiting for this for 15, 20 years. I think the Archaea ones came out a while ago. I just didn't have the money, but a really thorough collection of his work has been due for a long time. I became aware of his work in 2001. I had just dropped out of the Kubert School. I went there for like until Christmas break of 2000, and then I dropped out. Um, but my friends Bjorn Hansen and Wendell Ellebon and I shared a room with the Kubert School at the time figure drawing instructor Sergio Carrillo, who was doing Sword of Azrael, I think was the book he was working on at the time. So we all shared a room and went to San Diego Comic-Con in the summer of 2001. And we came back to the room after one of the nights with like all the crap that we bought. Sergio could buy stuff we couldn't. And it was like this big, thick, and I'm pretty sure it had a yellow cover, like a blank yellow cover with just like Sergio Toppi written on it and maybe a small piece of art. And I think it was probably in Italian or something. And he was showing us like how excited he was that he found this book. And I remember him opening up the book. And first off, I mean, you look at any of Toppi's art and it's just like anyone who loves drawing and illustration will just pull open a couple pages. We don't even really need to flip through the book because you can just pull open like any page. And this is the type of just amazing composition and illustration that you're getting. We're going to show, like, you know, obviously influenced by Gustav Klimt, like these very pattern stuff. Shiraz Day has some color. I'm not so excited about him in color. I think it's in black and white that he's his strongest. But I remember Sergio Carrillo opening the book and seeing these designs and seeing this artwork. And I was immediately fascinated by what seemed like things you shouldn't be doing in drawing. Like I immediately, within a minute of looking at this book, said, how is this guy doing this? Like so many of his lines are going in directions they should not go, but it looks amazing. And that haunted me so bad. And I went home from the Comic-Con and I started typing his stuff on like Sergio Toppi on the internet. And, you know, 2001, you'd get like these crappy little JPEGs like that. And you couldn't even hardly find images of his work on the internet at the time. And so it's just a name that's haunted me. And as internet got better, you know, you have more art. I could see more of his art. And he's just someone I've held in this kind of mythical status for a long time, all because Sergio Carrillo showed me those. I think they were the original Italian works. So I don't think we really need to flip through the books. We're going to just look at some of the art on screen, and then I have some reproduction issues, especially that I'm curious to hear Sean talk about. Okay, so let's take a look at what it was that actually I think baffled me when I first saw his art. I'll be able to describe it more. First off, you get the impact of just the composition overall and his use of shape in general. It's like this big interlocking puzzle piece where each little negative shape, you know, all these spaces in and around, he'll distort anatomy and stuff to ensure that they're compelling shapes, like this whole area here as well. That's just kind of background art. You know, all of this right here is, I think, really compelling shapes. This is like, you know, this really nice blade over here. So there's no shape goes to waste in this puzzle that he's creating. And then what jumped out to me when Sergio first opened the book is his almost abuse of the directionality of the lines that he uses. So if I had, say I have a shoulder, someone's shoulder, what I've normally tell my students is, when you're thinking about cross-hatching, you want to kind of identify the pole of it, you know, like the axis of it and the equator, and those would be good directions to do your hatching in, or at 45s to that. What you probably don't want to do is, like, if this is the front and then you imagine going around the back, you wouldn't want to ink this way because it would make the thing look like flipped inside out, basically.
Looks convex instead of concave. Or sorry,
Yeah.
concave instead of convex.
Yeah, it looks like dipped in instead of rounded over. And that's depending on the form. And he'll do plenty of things like right here where he is following the form, but then you'll get just a lot of really weird mark making, especially in the shadow areas, that go really in what I would say is like the opposite direction of what it should. Like right here, and then the way they overlap in these weird ways is just very peculiar. Or he'll like make a patch. Like normally I would tell my students too, don't like have things have patches around them because it makes the object feel disconnected. You would like want some of this cross hatching to bleed over into the cross hatching next to it so things don't feel partitioned off. But he'll like make these, it's almost like a little mosaic that he's
Mhm.
piecing together, um which should leave the image all kind of jacked up and inside out looking and torn apart and disconnected. But to me his work still feels like very dimensional in a sense. It doesn't feel terribly flat, and it reads as a total image, um
But
but
I,
at the same time feeling fractured in like a mosaic. And that just absolutely fascinates me. And his decision making, like when he's drawing, like what's going on in his brain where he goes, okay, now I'm going to just do a line this way. So
I
that's
like.
always baffled me.
I wonder what this would look like, how successful this image would be if it didn't have those very thick marks inside of the brow and the eye and the mouth and the chin that sort of are defining the expression and also seem like they're anchoring in a way that's similar to like a spotted black or something like that.
Yeah, his like contour work really
Hmm.
holds it down. When we do the recreation, I definitely think that's his process. I think contour first,
Yeah,
and big thick contour first.
right.
And I think that's where he really pays attention to the interlocking shapes. And then I think he'll go, like you said, spot the big blacks. And then from there, I think it is a process of like a mosaic. So he's looking just at the rhythmic flow. Like in the backgrounds, you get it even more because he really doesn't need to concern himself with the form anymore. And
Right.
you get these kind of roiling rhythmic lines that are just, the Toppi look. And you'll see that even, and I think that's why he likes those costume kind of things too, is because they lend themselves to rhythm and pattern and that kind of flattening out puzzle piece interlocking, but they're always exaggerated too.
Hmm.
um, and you'll see it on the rocks. And
Before we were recording, we were talking a little bit about, but both of us had kind of independently came to the conclusion that some of the influence on that, the sort of, you know, use of figure, but also like selective flattening of uh, of things would be the sort of German expressionists, late 19th century, early 20th century, Gustav Klimt and his friend Egon Schiele.
yeah, and like Klimt kind of gets stuck into the art nouveau sometimes, but yeah, I think it's more properly expressionist. I don't know, they're kind of off on their own. The two of them I put in their own little category almost. It starts with Klimt, and then Chile's like his kind of
Disciple.
protege who winds up, Klimt says, oh, he's a better draftsman than me. But it's that I think the influence there, or the thing I see, is twofold. One is the interest in the drapery,
Mhm.
and the other thing is the attentiveness to shape, and those go hand in hand. The drapery becomes part of the flattening technique that flattens things down to the picture plane. So you see
Right.
that this really great awareness of how the interlocking puzzle pieces of the shapes go in the Klimt and even out into the negative space there. Yeah, you get that in the Chile too. Even the fact that whatever this is, whether this is part of the figure or not, that it carves up this negative space into two shapes,
Right.
and flattens that out and activates that triangle there, is kind of indicative of the stuff that we're
And
seeing in Toppi.
I can see another commonality too, in that so this Chile image we're looking at right here is part of a series that he did where he would do figure drawings from life in charcoal, and then he would take them back to the studio and tart them up with some gouache, and that you get this combination of like referenced and sort of like storytelling aspect that comes from the figurative thing, and then you have the second stage of the sort of decorative, like taking this and making a decorative motif out of it. And Klimt takes that to the lunatic extreme, and you see all of these sort of floating amoeba inside of these little shapes. And you could think about it literally, like, okay, well, they got a quilt there or whatever, but really what it boils down to is he liked to do it. He's getting pleasure out of creating this little unit that's sitting on top of the area and filling it up. And there's something about that that's like aesthetically pleasing and also jarring. And it's funny that he's sort of like dorm room wall at this point, just because people have sort of embraced it. But this is really, it just happens to be images that were reproduced a lot or whatever, and we sort of stopped looking at them. But this is really subversive art,
and totally innovative, and still totally like you can't get near it without kind of betraying your influence.
Right.
He went so far down his idiosyncratic path that you can't get near it.
Right. Without
the fact that Toppi gets near it is like, well, okay, Toppi's on his own idiosyncratic path, but you've got Klimt. And they're both heavily fascinated. Even Klimt, using color, always emphasizes the contour lines, which I think is another key to the Toppi puzzle. Is like you said, they go get the contour, and that sets the kind of realism of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the decorative part can go on top of that. And that's why Klimt said Schiele surpassed him, is because Schiele was such a confident draftsman. It's just, straight to it, one line, confident contour line. Even Klimt, when you see his drawing, sketched a little bit. So Toppi has that, I think, the confidence to his contours on full display a lot of the times, and that lets the decorative aspects. And when we recreate the stuff, I think we're both going to focus on what we think was the steps there,
right,
that will hopefully further illuminate it. So those first two pieces, I think, are indicative of what I saw when Sergio Carrillo showed it to me, that I found this guy so mystifying, and I've spent so many years trying to decode it. So the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, Sean, was reproduction issues, and you noticed it immediately when you were looking at the work as well. This is from volume 1 of the magnetic stuff.
Okay.
And this is the fantasy volume, and this one has some really razor thin fine lines, and to me they looked like it was maybe printed digitally, because it had, well, behind you, that quilt behind you has the perfect example of what we're talking about when we talk about stair stepping, that when you do lines with pixels, and you have a super thin line that's 1 pixel wide. Let me stop sharing my screen. God knows if this is going to cause another technical problem. But Sean, can you use your quilt to explain the concept of stair stepping?
100%. So this is an example of a sampling grid, and that this quilt is made up of a certain amount of units up and down and across. Anytime you are sampling an image, and you're filtering it through a grid like this. So basically, like if you halftone an image, if you want to quote unquote reproduce gray or quote unquote reproduce color, you're having to sample this with printer dots. You're having to sample an image with printer dots. And the thing is, if the image that you're trying to sample is fairly thick, like this big old line going across here, then you can get a reasonable facsimile of that image through your grid, your sampling unit. And the smaller you get that sampling unit, the more likely that the image or the info that you're trying to get across is going to be still intact. But if you were to take like a yardstick and sort of rotate it across like this, there are going to be different areas and different directions that are going to sample more or less accurately. In other words, if you had a straight up and down line on this quilt, that was exactly the width of your sample, it would look fine, right? If you tilted it just a teeny bit, it would look absolutely horrible because you can't represent that tilted line at just a slight angle with something as crude as like 64 squares by 64 squares. So when looking at an image on a monitor, the pixels are squares, just like this quilt. When you're looking at an image in print that has been half-toned, the images are actually made up of small printer dots, depending on the type of half-toning that they used at the printer. If they use stochastic screening, you're talking about random variation in the size and placement. If you're talking about traditional screening, you're talking about basically the dots are either smaller or larger, depending on the density. But basically, you're always sampling through some kind of grid if you are choosing to have halftone in an image. And so,
and stair stepping is like if I take one of those 45-degree angle lines and it looks like stairs going up. Right?
If it's actually visible to you, that motion of the stair, like that's stair stepping. Yeah.
If you have a super thin line and you're reproducing it like that, it's like, say you have a line that the artist drew that's so thin that on the screen it's only 1 pixel wide, it's going to get that stair stepping effect if you reproduce it that way. So when I looked at these books from both companies, those super thin lines looked stair steppy to me.
Right.
Very, the thick line's not so bad. So that's something I wanted to look at, and we figured out what that is about. And then there's also like a reason why I think they're doing this. So here's an example of the stuff from volume 1, which is where I first noticed it. And you'll see the dot pattern that Sean's talking about there. So on the thicker lines, I didn't notice it too bad just from the naked eye, but on these thin lines, you can see it's a broken up line that kind of has the stair step effect into that series of dots. And I don't think most people would notice that. I don't want to knock on these. They're beautiful books, and I'm so grateful that these works are here, but I noticed it, and then it was like, well, why in the world are you doing that? Which is what you asked me too, right? You were like,
yeah,
why did they halftone these?
Right. And we were sort of mulling over some of the different reasons that might occur. It's because these are translated books. The most obvious reason is this is what his estate or the publisher of this work, who has the rights to it, supplied them with, is grayscale files as opposed to bitmap adjusted files. But then you still have the question of why would that occur in the first place? And there are a couple different reasons that might be. But it might be worth noting, anytime you see color printing, unless the color printing is done with spot colors, you are seeing this effect as well. The difference with color, though, is that your eye, there's a physiological difference. Your eye is actually more adept at seeing with high contrast images. And basically, the higher contrast that an image is, the more your eye is able to differentiate small details from that. And that's because you have a whole different mechanism for viewing lightness and darkness than you do from viewing color. And so
the rods in your eye are a contrast detector, and the cones are color detectors.
That's right. So the cones in your eye, that whole vision system is basically superimposed upon your older vision system.
Speaking of which, reptiles,
right, don't have color vision as far as I'm aware. And so those portions of your eye that are able to detect, differences in a black and white drawing or something like that are actually much more refined than the ones that are able to detect differences in color. And it's actually interesting because I happen to believe that line drawings reach a different type of, they reach you in a different kind of way. And I think that it's possible that the physiological mechanism of looking at a line drawing it's physically different. I mean, not only is it physically different from you, but the psychological phenomenon of decoding a line drawing might be linked to a different portion of your brain due to the fact that you're actually literally looking at it with a different vision system.
Well, yeah, I mean, that makes total, we're going to go off topic here, but it's actually an interesting off topic. I've never thought about that, but you're correct. There's a couple things that go on with the rods. We'll leave the reptile up. A, this is a beautiful composition, more beautiful Toppi composition. B, it's got a reptile on it. So the rods are, my understanding is rods are actually lower resolution in general, but they are cued towards seeing value and movement. And the nerves of the rods often reconnect right back to the eye. So the rods are very much to do with like just detecting motion, and you don't want that to filter back to the brain and then have to be processed and then send instructions to the body, like to have a quick response. Because if it takes that much higher order processing, you're going to get eaten. So there's nerves actually in the eye that cycle right back to controlling the eye. It doesn't ever make it to the brain. So when you like you see motion out of the corner of your eye and you look, and then they're like, why are you looking at me? It's like, why are you looking at me? It's before it ever even got to your brain that there was something over there. Your eyes have moved already. And what they're doing is they're focusing the fovea, which is the cones, and that has the color receptors, and the color receptors come with higher resolution data in general. And so that's focusing, and then your brain's piecing it all together. I'm actually curious now that you're saying black and white line work may be tapping into something more primal in a sense, because part of that initial assessment of the world, the lower resolution assessment of the world, is edge detection. Because when you're navigating the world, the important thing is the edge, the shape. And this is actually really interesting for Toppi's work, because he's so aware of shape as well, but he's primarily a line artist. And I found this through many, many, many years of teaching drawing, is that most people are biased towards edge detection. So they outline and they cartoon and stuff, because evolutionarily, it makes sense to navigate the world on edges. And it's only when something becomes important or broken that you slow down and you consider the surface. So here, like, you know, he's left the whole surface of the mushroom out for the most part, because you don't really need that unless you all of a sudden interested in like, can I eat it? And I need the color detail on it. So I have a hard time getting students to develop an awareness of shape because they're so biased to edge. So that is an interesting question about if line and black and white work is tapping into that more primal thing. That I'd never thought about it that way, but it totally makes sense. It's your edge detection system.
The thing that you were saying about the resolution of the cones supposedly being superior to the resolution of the rods, that may be true in some type of metric that I'm not aware of, but this as a phenomenon has been studied. It was actually studied by the U.S. government. I believe it was during the period between World War I and World War II, in relationship to pilots and how they could communicate different types of information. And there might be some other type of like spy component to it as well, where microfiche and things like that. But basically, the things that are still used right now to define quote unquote resolution are actually targets that were made by the U.S. Air Force. Resolution targets, and they are basically images that have very, very small text with certain letter patterns, and they're reproduced at different sizes with very sophisticated, reproduction in order for analysis of those different letter shapes. And basically, like I forgot what they're called T targets or something like that. And basically, the resolution could be measured in T size, T number. And so, a T6 resolution means that you can resolve the letters of this statement at the number 6, the 6th smallest on this sheet. And a T7,
that makes sense, because a letter is a high contrast. So I think what they're saying is able to resolve object from background, which is an edge detection thing, right?
Yeah.
So that makes sense, because it's high contrast edge detection at high speeds too. Yes. If they're doing it in Air Force, what I'm talking about is more like pixels on a screen resolution. So painterly resolution, being able to like study a surface and get like fine grained, differentiations. It not like not big jumps in value and edge, but you know, fine grain changes in value and color and things like that would go into like a really realistic, like trompe l'oeil painting of a rock or something, where you get every little detail of a rock. I think that's what I mean by the resolution. Sure. And well, that's a cone thing because it involves color.
Okay, well, the technical definition of resolution from a visual standpoint is literally, does the thing resolve? Is the thing that's being sampled recognizable through the sampling mechanism? And if the sampling mechanism is your eye, do you understand what it is that you're looking at this, this thing? The reason that color printing works in the first place is that we actually have very poor edge detection in terms of our color system,
and so that merges together.
Exactly. Yeah. You're looking at the thing, and your visual abilities to discriminate are not high enough that you're actually seeing the dots that the color image is composed of. Which actually, by the way, people say, oh, that's always the case. Well, you can train yourself to see it, by the way, if you let it really drive yourself nuts. I can see individual printer dots on certain kinds of printing.
Yeah, which is part of the reason that when we're looking, like me and Sean have, managed to hone our eyes to this level. And that's why when I'm looking at this book, I thought, man, those lines look pixelated. Anyone else who's looking at this book is going to go, oh my God, this is a beautiful book. Beautifully reproduced. Like, thank goodness Toppi's finally in English.
And once again, no knock on anybody for this. Just a curious question for us. And I think you see maybe initially, you think about this. I mean, this Mr. Toppi made work all throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and a time not necessarily known for very good reproduction. And you see a lot of the fine stuff that's happening there underneath that mushroom there, and you get the idea of why somebody might have said, well, hey, look, let's do this as a halftone, because you've got those areas where he scraped out the white there. It looks here. Like, yeah.
And it almost looks like he draws with chalk a lot of the times.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. That might just be, how. So basically, the halftoning process can catch a bunch of stuff that would otherwise be blown out to black.
Here's a good example. So here's another example of why I think they're doing it, because he uses wash in a way where I'm not sure that he's intending to black those details out or not. I don't know if he drew all that and then said, well, no, I don't like it, I want to black it out, because it's washy, it's not black.
Well, you get a little closer in.
Well, and then I also wanted to show here, I believe he is doing some type of drawing with chalk or something on top of the image, maybe on some of this stuff. It looks like it has more than just ink. And they're also reproducing the pencils, so he obviously hasn't erased his pencils. And from my standpoint, it's kind of cool to see that, because I can see a bit of his process. Back in on there's the washed area.
Yeah, I wonder about that. It almost looks to me like a like a stamp on top after the fact.
The drawing,
the wash that you're seeing on top of those black lines almost looks like he stamped it with a cloth or something like that, like some type of transfer.
He does do that a lot. I didn't scan any of those. He has a really wide variety of ink techniques. A lot of them do involve, I don't think any of the images I scanned have that in it, but he will pick up like a piece of burlap or something.
Right.
This might have that. So here's another one where the top two are obviously meant to just be black and white line work. And then on the third panel, he's put a gray over it, and it's not as dark as his blacks. And I don't know if he just changed his mind compositionally and blacked it out, or he's stamping or washing or something on top of that. And so he's trying to preserve, like when they're shooting his artwork, they don't want to get it all the way out to black because they're trying to preserve the ink wash.
Right.
Some of that new, like right here too, there's textural nuance in the stamping or the ink. There's also this weird thing where a lot of times within his lines, it will just like like right here, it's all black lines, but then it washes out for a minute. Like whatever tool he's using
Hmm.
puts down less ink in
Yeah,
his actual drawn lines. Like there too, it does it.
that's a
So I
flat tool of some type, huh? Look at that flat edge that he's got going there. You think that he's using like a lettering nib?
yeah, and it's like the ink is getting like dried out or
Hmm.
something. I'm speculating that he might be using a flat brush. But
Okay.
even here, it's like he went out and erased or something. The ink's getting lighter here.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the reason that I was suggesting that that might be a transfer. The same with that bottom one too. I don't know if you ever done an acetone transfer of a photocopy before, but that
Oh,
is
like he scribbled it and huh. That's interesting.
or a
I don't
lift,
know.
like a acetone lift or an some type of lift off of the ink afterwards. Although it
And
looks
here
more like a
he's
transfer to
obviously
me.
drawing to me with two different tools, like a lighter tool and a darker
Yeah.
tool. So there's a lot of nuance to, I mean, he's using so many different techniques, and you get that up there too, where it's lighter and darker. I think another thing is maybe he's drawing with like technical pins for some areas.
Uh-huh.
And so you get the lighter values, and then he's drawing with like a nib pin on top of that.
And then we
And
see more razor right there. You see that white razor right on top of the line work.
I think that might be chalk though. There's none of that stutter that a razor would get.
How?
It's like very clean.
Yeah, but it's so thin. I don't know if chalk necessarily would reproduce that cleanly
Yeah, I
as
don't
well.
know. There's a lot of techniques of his that remain mysterious to me. Like you get it down here too, where it might be like that looks more like razor because it has that stutter,
Hmm.
but this looks very clean, but it doesn't look like white ink either. I don't know. His stuff is very, I mean, this is why even like Sienkiewicz and Simonson and Dave McKean, I mean, people just hold him in the highest regard because he's just good. And a lot of what he does is mysterious, and the choices he makes are totally mysterious. Uh, so,
Oh,
anyways, I think they're trying to preserve that. But I wanted to ask you also, like, you tend to try and say, okay, I'm going to take anything that's black and make sure it reproduces black. And like you would typically edit out and clean up the pencils. And that's the normal kind of
uh-huh.
thing that you're aiming for with work like this. Like, where would you kind of go with it? You know, what,
Yeah.
and there's
Well,
stuff here where it looks, you know, like it's still not capturing everything. So, what do you think kind of the, I mean, if you don't have access to the artist and a conversation with the artist anymore, what do
right.
you think the like decision making process and ethics of like going about that?
Yeah, I think that I can tell you that I've had a few um, opportunities to do this where I'm looking at a page that clearly has something that's not going to reproduce in a line context, but everything else on the page is going to reproduce in a line context. And one of the things that you can do if you have enough time, and if a licensor is going to allow you to do it, like I say, that's the other thing is, I mean, Magnetic or whoever's publishing these now is getting these files from somebody who is asking them to reproduce them from these files, probably as is, and that might even be written into their contract. So it might not be something that they would even be able to do. But
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
It's not
and
like they're getting scans of the art and are
no,
adjusting it on their own. Yeah.
no, exactly. They're getting what are probably intended to be completed files, and basically they're just swapping out the lettering for English lettering. Uh, but the the opportunities that you have when you're actually working directly from the original art are to selectively identify areas that are not going to reproduce otherwise. And some different types of things like dry brush and chalk and things like that, you can really just sharpen the bejesus out of them. And with some really careful sharpening, a process that you can do, in Photoshop, what you can basically do is um, create some micro contrast that enables that to survive the printing process. But you can also selectively grab those areas and either use, if they don't have a lot of contrast, or sorry, they don't have a lot of darkness to them, you can use what's in Photoshop is called diffusion dither, which in the real world of printing is called oh Jesus, diffusion dither. What is the real name of that? It's called stochastic screening, and basically what it is
randomized dots.
Randomized dots that can represent a grayscale image. So this is a page from The Strange Death of Alex Raymond.
I want to contrast it to, let me get back to, because this one had real good pencil. So these are both scans of the printed source at 1200 dots per inch. So this is the Toppi book. And you can see here they were getting, if you back up, you can see it looks like pencil. But at that 1200, it all turns into dots, and the lines break down, and they get the stair stepping and the dots. And I mean, even black, which should be black all the way through, has white going all over it.
Right.
This is a 1200 DPI scan of a page out of Strange Death of Alex Raymond.
Right. And this is a page that I identified. Now, once again, this is not the production file. This is a scan that Carson just made of the printed page. And
actually, sorry, this is the scan.
Yeah. So I was going through the book, and I saw this page in particular had some pencil on there. I did this on a couple other pages too, but this particular one seemed very important that I reproduce all of the pencil that was on the original artboard. And the reason for that is because this is the page that Dave was working on when his wrist basically made it so that he's very difficult for him to draw anymore without being able to and just be in immense pain.
And I think you can see that in the lines right there where he's testing them, and they're just sloppy, and he can't control the distance.
And there's a slight deterioration in the few pages before this, but basically, I mean, he was at the top of his game, and then his wrist was falling apart. I mean, it's like his hand felt like it was going to fall off, and he couldn't get anything happening anymore on it. And I thought, due to the fact that this was sort of tied in with the themes of the book and tied in with his process on the book, and the book is about him teaching himself how to draw like these masters, and I thought that having an accurate portrayal of where he left it out was very important. And so I identified all the areas that were not going to reproduce all the pencil, and I used diffusion dither to turn those areas into very, very fine dots. And then I merged that with the rest of the book, or the rest of the portion of the page that was all basically line art. So I adjusted the entire page for line art, and then I dropped in the areas of pencil converted to diffusion dither using the stochastic screening, and dropped that right on top of the rest of the line work. And so what you get is a kind of perfect marriage of quote unquote perfect reproduction of the line work along with all of the grayscale elements. And
I mean, just wild dramatic difference between that, which is, and these pages are about the same size, because the book is about the same size. It's a little smaller. Actually, this image is a little smaller than if we had printed it in Strange Death of Alex Raymond.
Yeah.
I mean, just night and day difference. And like, that still looks like an ink line, and that looks like pencils. This all looks like one merged field of like Andy Warhol dots.
Right. And the reason you can get that so fine is the stochastic screening. Number one, everything, the stochastic screening enables you to essentially, it's like dirt. I mean, it's like the printing surface is just basically a bunch of dirt on there. I mean, the dots are so fine because the dots don't have to be perfect circles. You can get a much finer screen to it.
Yeah, I mean, even zooming in, you can barely.
Yeah, well, you scanned it at 1,200 pixels per inch, but the plates were made at 2,400 pixels per inch, so much finer resolution space. And yeah, the stochastic screening basically enables you to have very, very fine screening, because basically the limitation of traditional screening is that since they have to be dots, those dots individually have to resolve. But if they're made essentially randomly and at random sizes and everything like that, the dots can be much finer and you get away with it. The only real downside to it is that it muddies up darker or mid-tone areas a lot quicker because they fill in easier because they're smaller and more tightly packed. So I wouldn't do that on a page where you had a bunch of dark or mid-tone areas you were intending to reproduce.
So something like this might be problematic because it has like this area here.
Yeah, maybe. But the other thing you could always do is supply just those portions of it as a grayscale file that is sitting on top of your line art file. You know, an image like this is actually, yeah, a lot more complex. I would probably have cut out sections of this, you know, assuming you had the original art and you were able to do whatever it is that you wanted to do.
So you would have like had all of the line work within this boundary just be halftone.
Yep.
Including this stuff.
That's right.
At least this stuff. Because here you won't see it because it bleeds. And then here you could clean those lines up.
Exactly. And you know, don't think that that's a manual process for me. I'm basically, I write scripts that do all this work so that, you know, hopefully the computer is doing most of the work for you. But yeah, it generally knocks out most of the pencil. And you know, I write like a multi-stage script when I'm starting a book. And then I'll test it out on a bunch of different pages. And so hopefully the manual cleanup work that I do is really only on aged material or things like that. But yeah, this would be an interesting technical challenge to do. And, you know, like I said, you would have to actually talk to his estate, you know, if they really care about it, get them to approve the files and things like that. When you're translating something, you really are at the mercy of the people who have the rights to that work. You know,
and what they'll provide you with, because you would need scans of the original art to do that. You couldn't do that from these files, right?
It depends on the resolution of the files, but yeah, if they were made at a high enough resolution, I could certainly work from that to do something like that. But yeah, it depends on how they were supplied. If they were supplied at like a typical, you know, like 300 pixels per inch at size or something like that, no, you probably wouldn't want to do that from these files. This would be the best way to go. In that case.
Because there's stuff like this too where he's like obviously doing a smudge. So I get it. I get like totally understand why they want to preserve all of this, because I think in the original reproductions it would have just been black and white and you would have lost all of that and they would be like nightmare muddy reproductions as well. So thank goodness that we have all of this, because he is such a mysterious artist in terms of his process. It's so nice to be able to see where was he just scribbling away with the pencil, where was he, you know, he was planning out some of that directionality already in the pencils, which is still, you know, totally, the decision-making process is bizarre, but it's nice to have it out there. So I get why the estate would want that more accurate reproduction of what the master was actually up to.
It's interesting contrasting that with the Form and Void page I sent you. This is the Cerebus book that I recently finished, and there's gives you an idea of how it reproduced, a certain panel reproduced before. You just basically have this white, wandering white across the sky, and then if you look underneath, you get an idea of what it's going to look like in the new edition. And you can see that on the artboard, there was a ton of wash happening there and a lot of nuance in terms of the little flare outs of the stars and everything like that.
And like the streaks, like they almost look like a bunch of shooting stars, whereas here they're all static. Right. There's so much more motion to all of this. I had no idea that Gerhard ever used a wash.
Yeah, well, it never was reproduced as a wash, so
yeah,
I was delighted to find these pages hiding in there. He used it on 4 or 5 pages, and presumably when it came back from the printer, he was like, "Well, fuck, I'm never going to do that again."
Yeah, and that tree, I mean, look at how much better that tree looks.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
in the case of this book, it was a lot easier for me to make those kinds of decisions because it basically was, these panels have this going on, and so basically I could isolate those panels and reproduce those panels in grayscale. Uh, in this case, I don't even remember if I used stochastic screening. I'll have to look at what I did, but I might have just applied it as a grayscale file and planning on giving instructions to the printer to use the tightest screen they can.
But then keep this
Exactly.
area here as
Yep.
like just a line art. It's so great because I mean that's another thing that we're talking about reproduction issues. It could change the way the artist produced it. Like you said, Gerhard probably saw this come back and said, well, I'm not wasting my time on that.
Right.
And so forevermore, the book lost what could have been
Right.
some more of these really cool nuanced tricks that he could have used, and he just threw them out because it wasn't worth it. And not that Cerebus ever got bad or but
No.
it's kind of a bummer that seeing a bad reproduction skewed someone. Like if Toppi would have seen his original stuff be poorly reproduced in the 70s and been like, screw it. He seemed to persist anyways, and like he has this kind of fine art aesthetic where like this stuff where he's like rubbing out the inks or whatever's going on there, that could have all gone away in his art. And then now that we're at a place where we can reproduce it
Right.
just wouldn't, like most of Gerhard's art doesn't have that there to reproduce. So
Right.
I mean that's another one of these reasons where it's like, as much as I feel like we're being nitpicky when I come back to these production issue things, that I just like I only want to talk about this because god damn it, Sean, now I can't look at books anymore because you've ruined me after seeing how good our stuff reproduced. There's so many reasons where it's like, man, once you see the ramifications of that, like it can change the course of how an artist draws, and you could be missing out on a lot of really wonderful techniques and stuff
Yeah.
just because they saw 5 pages look like shit.
Right. And that's the double-edged sword of the reproduction, conundrum, because on the one hand, a comic artist can reach thousands of people, and in a deep lived-in way that they might not, an oil painter who isn't working for any reproduction at all might not. On the other hand, the oil painter only has the original to worry about. And
Yeah.
if it looks bad in the catalog or whatever, it's like, well, fuck it, I still got my giant painting.
Yeah. Yeah. Like
and
I have actually, I just got, this just happens to be on hand. I got a big book that I just knocked myself out with from the painting I had that was it won an award in the Art Renewal Center. I'm not
nice.
planning on talking about that at all, but it has the reproduction of the piece in there. And when you're painting with painting, again going off topic, but it's at hand. So this painting here does not and never will reproduce well. This one here was the one that won, so I got
That's
to go.
your
That
painting.
hung, yeah,
Yeah.
that's my painting. It hung in Sotheby's, and that's what this book is a catalog
Awesome.
of. So that's cool. But it's such a dark painting, and it's intentionally painted in layers, and those layers are meant to trap light. You can't reproduce that. You just
Right.
have pixels on paper. I don't have transparent medium. So yeah, you inherently know when you make a painting, like if I do a good painting, it ain't going to reproduce right. If a painting reproduces really nice, it's probably a shit painting in person.
Well, yeah.
Honestly.
I wonder if somebody like Magritte almost seems like he's benefited from reproduction, because Magritte, his actual paint quality is fairly low in terms of like it has a little bit more of a poster paint kind of quality
Yeah,
in
flat.
person.
I'll mix it and put it on there, color by numbers, no layering or anything. Yeah.
Right, and he benefits from both the reduction and also the sort of flattening effect that the reproduction has. It's almost like his stuff looks better in print in a certain way than it does in person, where you can see his rather, comparatively clumsy brushstrokes and things like that.
Yeah, I'm up. We're way off topic now, but this is someone else who works with patterns, so I don't
Yeah,
know.
sure.
Whatever. I like that we go. This is the artist that currently is the most popular artist that I can think of that has this problem. His stuff reproduces amazing, and it's really cool looking images. Kehinde Wiley. He did Barack Obama's presidential portrait, but he does all of these really cool paintings of people that he's gone around. I mean, when he started, he would just go meet people off the street, and he would often pose them in the pose of a famous, like, old white guy painting, you know,
Right.
and then take these characters that he met off the street and do that. So they look amazing in reproduction because they're so focused on here's like, you know, they'll have them in the Napoleon's horse.
Right.
So amazing in reproduction. You go see these things in person.
Right.
And I've tried to tell that to students. They're like, oh, Kehinde Wiley's like so good. And I say, yeah, like he's a good image maker, but he's a shit painter. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's so good. And then we went and saw, I took some students to New York when I taught in Virginia, and we saw Kehinde Wiley in person. And I was a kid that was in my painting class and so knew about layering, and we took it up. And I said, what do you think about it now? And he's like, like, I see what you're talking about. His work's gotten better as he's gotten older. I don't want to shit on Kehinde Wiley. He has assistants now, I think.
Right, I was going to say, how much of that, what percentage of each of those paintings is actually represented by him anyway? I mean, you know,
anymore, not much, but the original ones, yeah. So there are issues like that with painting. Yeah, we got way off topic, but
there's a poster paint quality to it. I mean,
it's very flat.
Anyway, so shall we try to try our hand at some Sergio Toppi now?
Yeah, I want to try and decode him. I want to recreate because I want to try and decode some of what he's doing. And this is probably the image that we've got. It's one of the less exploratory images because I didn't want to mess with chalk and squishing like God knows what kind of fabric around and that kind of stuff. So
I'm going to make a quick recommendation for Carson, you and anybody else who's watching this. Pick this up. I think it's just a couple bucks on Aid Books. This is Joss A. Smith, who's a contemporary of Mr. Toppi, and he made a book called The Pen and Ink Book. And this has a bunch of techniques in here that are, you know, techniques that I would say are in the, you know, non-reproducible, like less for line reproduction world. And he talks about, you know, using your hands. He talks about using smudging tools that are not necessarily that. And you'll notice if you pick up the book that everything in the book is reproduced with halftone for that very reason, because at least at the time period that this book came out, those techniques that we're talking about would not have been feasible, and the reproduction that we talk about, the quality of reproduction we talk about, would not be necessarily feasible. And he has a lot of images in here that have some of that soft textural applique. Look,
a lot of ink wash.
Right. Well, and see, in this case, it's not actually ink wash, but the reproduction it's reduced, so it's harder to. He you know, used a heavy watercolor paper sized with gelatin, and let's see, this is a variation on the scratchboard technique. I sized a heavy watercolor paper with gelatin and then painted the surface with ink, omitting the areas that were to be pure white. After the ink dried, the drawing was done. I sandpapered it off of the paper.
Oh.
The thin lines of the drapery were scratched with a dental pick.
So he basically made like a black surface and then carved into it and sanded off and stuff.
Right. And this beautiful, beautiful texture of the skin here is all sandpaper.
Yeah, so you're using the tooth of the paper. That's like a painting technique. You use the tooth of the canvas and you sand out.
Right.
Yeah.
And this guy, Joss Smith, is sort of like Toppi, straddled the line of fine art and illustration back when illustration actually paid enough money for people to, you know, make images like this.
Be really beautiful with it. Yeah.
Right. So I think this book is probably a key towards getting some of those, you know, those outdoor techniques, and it's worth a read. And I'll look up and see what we can find on Aid Books for this.
Yeah, I'll try and get one of those. That looks awesome.
Yeah, get it before we post the video, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I will. I'll be looking tonight because otherwise people are going to be going and looking for it. All right, so it's going to take a quick pause and set up, and then we'll come back and try and do our best Toppi.
You want to see all these books? Smash that and you get them!